Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a world that floats literally. You're standing barefoot on cool, damp soil that gives a little under your weight, not quite earth, not quite water. The air hums gently with mosquitoes and wood smoke. A thin ribbon of mist curls across the glassy lake as the sun stretches over the horizon. In the distance, faint echoes of paddle strokes and early morning bird song blend with the rustle of corn leaves. You're in Tenochtitlan, the great capital of the Aztec Empire. But forget everything you think you know about ancient cities. This one isn't built with stone and dust. It floats, or at least it pretends to. You step cautiously onto a chinampa, a patch of farmland that rests in the shallow lakes around the city like a green raft. You probably won't survive this, by the way. I mean, the mosquitoes alone are plotting your downfall, and that's before you even consider how easy it is to slip off the muddy edge and into a tangle of lake roots. Still, it's oddly peaceful here. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you're watching. I love seeing where you all tune in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You kneel down and press your hand into the earth. It's cool, springy, alive. Corn stalks tower above you, their leaves whispering secrets. Marigolds nod in the breeze. Beneath your feet, a tangled network of roots binds the soil into place, preventing it from drifting into the lake. This is farming, but not as you know it. The city of Tenochtitlan was built on Lake Texcoco, a place the Mexica people were told to settle, by divine sign an eagle perched on a cactus devouring a snake. Poetic, sure, but not exactly the most convenient real estate. So to grow food, the Aztecs had to get creative, and thus chinampas. You shuffle to the edge of the garden and peer over. The water laps gently at the edges, thick with aquatic plants. Dragonflies skim the surface like tiny helicopters. You notice a canoe gliding toward you, its paddler standing in the stern, poling through the shallows with the ease of someone who's done this 1,000 times. These floating gardens weren't just clever, they were a miracle of environmental design. Historians still argue whether the chinampa system evolved naturally from earlier Mesoamerican techniques or if it was a radical innovation born of sheer necessity. Either way, what you're standing on is the result of centuries of muddy trial and error. A duck waddles past you with the confidence of a landowner. You nod respectfully. In this place, ducks, egrets, and humans all share space in a strange choreography of survival. And somehow the system works. A mainstream fact, chinampas could yield up to 7 harvests per year, far outperforming European fields of the same era. That's right. While your average medieval farmer in France might pray for one decent crop a year, here in the Valley of Mexico, the Aztecs were pulling tomatoes, squash chilies, and corn from their lakeside plots like a vending machine on overdrive. You start walking along the narrow path between plots, balancing carefully. No handrails here, just mud and muscle memory. To your left, a farmer hums as he tends to young maize shoots. His face is painted with blue smudges, a sign he's recently attended a religious ceremony. Or maybe he just tripped into the indigo vat again. Hard to tell. The sun climbs slowly. You're sweating now, the kind of gentle, sticky heat that makes your clothes cling in all the wrong places. A teenage girl tosses you a water gourd with a grin that says, "You're clearly not from around here." You take a sip. It tastes faintly of squash, and something herbal like peppermint and pond water had a mildly successful blind date. The chinampas aren't just food factories. They're part of the Aztec calendar, religion, even military logistics. As you'll soon discover, these floating fields are more than meets the eye. But for now, you're content to sit in the shade of a willow tree, legs dangling over the edge, feet skimming the water. Somewhere nearby, a flute begins to play, a soft, slow tune that seems to drift across the lake like mist. You close your eyes. The scent of wet earth, crushed herbs, and distant tortillas fills your lungs. Even here, centuries before European boots ever touched the lake bed, There's a quiet urgency to everything. The plants grow fast, the people move quickly, and the system runs like a pulsing organic machine. One last quirky tidbit before we drift forward. Aztec farmers were known to fertilize their crops with lake sediment and occasionally human waste. Sustainable, absolutely. A little gross. Also, yes, but hey, waste not, want not. You open your eyes again, the flute has stopped. The air holds its breath, waiting for your next move. You're back in the canoe now, gliding deeper into the watery maze that encircles Tenochtitlan like a liquid spider web. Each paddle stroke sends tiny ripples out across the still lake, distorting your reflection, just enough to remind you you're not in Kansas anymore. Not even close. This isn't just a city with canals, it's a city of canals. Streets are water, sidewalks are narrow garden paths, and the idea of traffic means maneuvering around ducks delivery boys with baskets of tamales and the occasional priest sailing by on official religious business. You glance to your left. Rows of houses stand on small islands, their walls built of adobe and stone, their roofs covered with woven mats and palm leaves. Between the homes are slivers of green, tiny backyard chinampas, where families grow herbs, flowers, and maybe a suspicious-looking chili or two that's hotter than divine forgiveness. As you round a corner, the city begins to reveal its architecture-step pyramids, rising like mountains from the lake bed, glinting in the morning light. Bridges span some of the wider canals, temporary ones designed to be removed in times of invasion. Tenochtitlan wasn't just beautiful, it was a fortress. Historians still argue whether the layout of the city was inspired more by practical engineering or spiritual cosmology. Likely both. The Aztecs saw their capital as the center of the universe literally. It was mapped to match the four cardinal directions with the Templo Mayor at its sacred heart. Urban planning meets divine instruction. Your canoe nudges past a man scooping algae from the water's edge. He waves. You wave back, trying not to topple in. The algae isn't just junk. He'll dry it out and mix it into cakes, which sound disgusting, but apparently pack quite the protein punch. You make a mental note: when in doubt, eat the lake. Here in the wetlands, the boundary between nature and civilization blurs. The canals themselves were engineered with such finesse that some still hold water today, buried beneath modern Mexico City's asphalt and fury. Back in the day, though, they weren't just transport routes. They were lifelines. You drift past a crew of workers repairing a canal bank. They reinforce the edges with woven reeds and pile on mud clay in thick fibrous mats. Willow trees stand like sentinels along the borders, their roots knitting everything together. A low wall of woven branches traps the mud in place, floating garden fences essentially. You run your fingers along one of the walls. It's soft and rough at the same time, like a loaf of bread that someone dropped in a puddle. It shouldn't work, but somehow it does. These walls have stood for generations, endlessly maintained, expanded, and rebuilt by people who know the lake better than most of us know our own kitchens. Want a fun fringe fact? Some scholars believe that the layout of the chinampas and canals resembled a massive agricultural grid from the air, potentially visible to gods or spirits looking down. Others say that's a stretch, and that the gods probably had better things to do than admire aerial symmetry. Still, imagine the satellite view. The city bustles even from your quiet spot on the water. Canoes dart in and out of narrow lanes, some carrying firewood, others vegetables, others children laughing as they trail their hands through the water. You pass a delivery boat with dozens of squash lashed together like green balloons. One of them winks at you. Probably. Or maybe you're just dehydrated. A child calls out from a passing boat, "Cuídate del axolote." You raise an eyebrow. Careful of the axolotl. You look down and oh wow, there it is. A plump, pinkish little salamander with a permanent smile and feathery gills floating beside you like a bizarre water puppy. The Aztecs considered axolotls sacred, possibly tied to the god Solotl, the divine twin who turned himself into a creature to avoid death. Cheeky move. Axolotls were also a food source, fried, boiled, dried. Tastes like chicken if chicken had gills and stared into your soul. The breeze picks up. You pass a floating bundle of marigolds bobbing gently, perhaps an offering, or just leftovers from a ceremony. Flowers were everywhere here, even in the grittiest parts of daily life. The Aztecs weren't just warriors and farmers. They were florists in a way. Beauty was function. Color was power. You stop at a floating market briefly, just a side trip promise. There women in bright skirts haggle over chilies, cacao, and little hand-woven bags. The market floats not literally, but the platforms seem to rise out of the water, stitched together with planks and poles. It smells like maize dough and incense, and just a hint of wet dog. You pick up a small figurine carved from obsidian shaped like a frog. The merchant smiles. For fertility, she says, then pauses, eyeing your awkward grin. Or maybe for luck in gardening. Who knows anymore? She winks. You pay in cacao beans, still a perfectly respectable currency here. By the time you climb back into the canoe, the sun has reached its lazy afternoon position. The lake sparkles. The city hums behind you. And ahead, more canals, more mysteries, and many more layers of mud-based genius. And just as you're beginning to think you've seen it all, a faint voice echoes across the water, a chant rhythmic and low. A ceremony, perhaps. Or maybe someone just really hates weeding and is trying to summon divine help. Either way, the city floats on. You step carefully off the canoe and onto another chinampa, this one narrower, the soil more freshly turned. A soft squish greets your sandals, but it holds. You crouch low, running your fingers through the dirt, damp, earthy, and weirdly warm. The garden feels alive, like it's exhaling beneath you. This, you're told, is where the magic happens. Chinampas are often called floating farms, but here's the plot twist: they don't actually float. Yeah, sorry to ruin the fantasy. They're anchored, very much anchored, built by driving wooden stakes into the lake bed, weaving reeds between them, and layering mud sediment, decaying plants, and more mud until the whole thing rises above water level, like a soggy layer cake. But hey, call them floating if it helps you sleep. The Aztecs sure did. You shuffle along a narrow garden path. On your left, corn, tall and proud. On your right, chilies, small and angry. And further ahead, a section of the chinampa has been left fallow, not because it's useless, but because the farmers are letting the soil rest. A concept medieval Europe wouldn't really get behind for another few centuries. Here's your mainstream history fix. The chinampa system could produce enough food to feed over 200,000 people. That's basically all of Tenochtitlan, plus some leftovers for their slightly jealous neighbors. It was efficient, sustainable, and way ahead of its time. And it wasn't just random dirt tossing. It was planned, rotated, maintained like a living quilt of green. You reach the center of the plot where a farmer, old sun-baked, missing 3 teeth, and 1 sandal waves you over. He's digging trenches between rows of beans, guiding lake water into the furrows. No fancy irrigation system, just smart design. The water comes in, the soil drinks, the plants grow, repeat until full stomach. He grunts something unintelligible, then hands you a digging stick. You try to mimic his movements, stabbing at the soil and wobbling like a toddler holding a javelin. He laughs softly, shaking his head. You'll feed 1 squirrel with that harvest, he mutters. Generous estimate. You move down the row. Each chinampa is part of a greater grid, a checkerboard of life that stretches for miles in every direction. Birds hop between rows, bugs whir by in loose formation, and somewhere in the muck, microscopic armies of bacteria work overtime to break down organic waste into sweet, fertile soil. That's the secret, really, waste. These chinampas thrive on it. The Aztecs scooped up lake-bottom sediment, fish bones, rotten fruit, kitchen scraps, and even human waste, and layered it all into the earth like the world's smelliest sandwich. Historians still argue whether the waste collection system was centrally organized or more of a do-it-yourself compost revolution, but the result is the same soil so rich it practically hums. You lean down and sniff the ground. Earthy, damp, slightly funky like the inside of a well-traveled sandal. But it's this smell, this pungent, potent mixture of rot and rebirth that made Tenochtitlan an empire. Not gold, not obsidian, dirt. You hear a splash behind you. Turning around, you spot a kid knee-deep in the canal, scooping mud into a basket with the seriousness of someone solving world hunger. Every few days, farmers refresh their plots with new sediment, keeping the soil from tiring out. It's a low-tech, high-yield system that would make most modern sustainability influencers cry with envy. Wiping your hands on your tunic, you glance up. A heron lands on the edge of the chinampa, eyeing you, as if to say, you don't belong here. Fair, but it's hard not to feel a little awe. This place is an ecosystem, a machine, a ritual all in one. And speaking of rituals, it wasn't all just mud pies and morning weeding. Some chinampas were marked off for sacred crops meant for temples or elite feasts. These plots were blessed, monitored, and sometimes surrounded by flower borders, aesthetic and holy, because obviously your deity deserves a decent side salad with their blood sacrifice. Fun fact, farmers would sometimes sleep out on their chinampas, guarding their crops and listening to the croc's buzzes and splashy arguments of the night. A chinampa could be home field and sanctuary. Just bring a hammock and maybe a stick for the raccoons. You find a cluster of young amaranth plants near the edge, their reddish leaves catching the sunlight. Amaranth was a staple here, versatile, nutritious, and sometimes used in religious ceremonies, especially when shaped into little edible statues of gods and later crushed ceremonially. Snack or blasphemy? You decide. A breeze rustles the leaves. The old farmer has vanished, probably off to mock some other poor soul trying to dig in this strange paradise. You sit down for a moment. Your hands are dirty, your legs sore, but your brain is buzzing with the sheer ingenuity of it all. Remember how we said these plots don't float? Well, one more twist sometimes. The canals around them are so deep, the islands look like they're drifting. They seem to move when the water ripples. They shimmer in the morning fog. No wonder Spanish invaders thought they'd wandered into some enchanted mirage. And maybe they had. You lay back staring up at the clouds. Somewhere nearby, a flute plays a few lazy notes. The soil beneath you is damp alive, constantly renewing itself. It's hard to tell where land ends and water begins. But that's the beauty of chinampas. You're never quite sure if you're grounded or floating. All you know is dinner's probably growing just inches from your elbow. You're up before dawn again. Because if you're an Aztec farmer, there's no sleeping in, no 5 more minutes. The chinampa waits. The compost waits. And apparently so do the night frogs, still croaking passive-aggressively under the reeds. Today you're learning what goes into this magic soil mix that's been beneath your feet all along. Spoiler, it's not exactly a spa treatment. You follow a group of workers to the edge of a wide canal where rafts of green algae drift lazily across the surface. One man jumps in with a splash, scooping up algae with a wide flat basket. Another wades into the shallows and comes up with hands full of black muck lake sediment, thick with centuries of decomposing everything. This, he tells you with a grin, is breakfast for the soil, not for you. You were starting to wonder. They haul the baskets onto shore, dumping their heavy contents into large woven bins. The smell is complex. A rich, swampy perfume that hits somewhere between wet dog and overcooked spinach. But to an Aztec gardener, this is gold. A mixture of lakebed detritus and organic decay that transforms lifeless dirt into fertile earth. Welcome to the Midnight Compost Club. Here's your mainstream historical fact for the morning. The Aztecs practiced rotational fertilization, moving fresh sediment from lake beds onto chinampas in cycles, allowing the islands to regenerate continuously without fallow seasons. It was one of the reasons their agriculture remained so stable even under massive population pressure. But that's not all that goes into the brew. You're handed a bowl, wooden shallow, suspiciously warm. Inside, you find a mix of crushed maize husks, kitchen scraps, bones, and something that looks very much like, is that dung human animal? You decide not to ask. Instead, you watch as the compost is mixed with the algae and lake mud in wide trenches along the chinampa edges. The smell intensifies a holy blend of life-death in Tuesday morning. And that's the point this mixture decays, heats up steams in the early sun. Microbes work overtime, turning stink into sustenance, a fringe tidbit. Some sources claim that even powdered crocodile dung was used to enrich certain soils or protect seedlings. Whether that's true or just someone making a joke at a very gullible scribe's expense, we may never know. But it wouldn't surprise anyone here if it helps something grow. It's going in. You help rake the mixture across the rows. It's not glamorous. Your hands are now the color of sadness, and you've gained a new respect for the phrase elbow deep in history. But there's something satisfying about it. This is agriculture as alchemy. Rot becomes food. Waste becomes wealth. And the earth hums a little louder beneath your toes. You glance over and see a pile of crushed shells, clam, mussel, snail. Lake Texcoco, though brackish in places, still had pockets of edible shellfish. The shells were used for calcium-rich amendments to the soil. You add a handful to the compost, listening to them crunch like dry leaves. A group of young workers arrives carrying baskets filled with dead plants' feathers and what looks like fish guts. Another kid proudly dumps in a rat carcass. You pretend that's totally normal because here it is. Historians still argue about the scale of centralized composting in the Aztec world. Was there a formal collection system, or did each family do their own dirty work? Did the temples manage sacred fertilizer zones? There's evidence in both directions, but what's clear is that the result was a deeply interconnected system where nothing went to waste. And maybe you're imagining it, but the plants on the freshly composted row seem to shimmer just a little brighter. You take a break under a tree again, a willow. They're everywhere here, planted deliberately around the edges of chinampas. Not just for shade, you're told, but because their roots grow fast and bind the earth together. It's like having nature as your construction crew. You sip water from a gourd and stare at your fingernails. They'll never be clean again. You're weirdly okay with that. A woman walks by with a basket of broken pottery, not trash. She crushes the shards and adds them to the trench. Pottery bits help with drainage, prevent root rot, and aerate the soil. It's like terracotta popcorn for plants. Bonus, they glitter a little in the sun. You look around. Everything here is part of something else's survival. Chickens roam between plots, scratching up bugs. Their droppings go into the compost. The compost feeds the soil feeds the corn feeds the people feed the chickens. It's an endless, messy, and deeply elegant circle. A cloud of tiny insects dances in the air. You wave them off, but the farmer beside you just laughs. Good compost draws good life, he says. You try to believe that. You walk back to your little corner of the chinampa, your shadow stretching long over the rows of amaranth and squash. You press your foot gently into the soil. It gives but doesn't crumble. Springy, strong. It feels like a promise. One last detail as the sun starts to dip, some chinampas were built entirely from scratch, each season layered bit by bit until they could support full crops within months. That's how rich this soil could become. Temporary land born from rot and hope. You lie down on a reed mat near the edge, listening to the buzz of flies, the flap of heron wings, and the gentle bubbling of lake water against mud. This isn't just farming, it's resurrection. And tomorrow you'll do it all over again. You wake to the sound of birds. Not polite little songbirds, mind you, loud, swampy, feathered chaos. Herons screech, ducks chatter, and somewhere a frog is playing percussion with its face. The sun is still low golden light dripping over the lake like honey. Time to plant more trees, specifically willows. You grab a bundle of skinny saplings from a canoe and slog over to the chinampa edge. The soil squelches beneath you like wet bread, but structurally sound. Barely. You jab a sharpened stick into the mud, then wedge in a young willow. One down, 76 to go. But this isn't just landscaping. You're reinforcing the skeleton of the chinampa. Willow trees were essential, their roots knit together the layers of mud reeds and compost, creating a living framework that prevented erosion and kept everything from sliding back into the water. Smart right. You press the next sapling into the muck. It quivers, slightly unsure about its new home. You pat it reassuringly. "You've got this," you whisper. The local farmer gives you a strange look. Maybe encouraging trees isn't standard here. Mainstream historical fact. The Aztecs didn't just use willows, they employed a whole range of trees for chinampa stabilization, including ahuejotes, a water-loving species native to the valley. These trees grew fast, held the chinampa edges firmly in place, and could be coppiced, cut back regularly for wood without killing the plant. You're sweating already. The sun climbs higher, and planting trees turns out to be hot, muddy, mosquito-infested work. But every tree you plant is a future anchor, a living fence post that'll keep your island solid through storms, floods, and the occasional over-enthusiastic duck stampede. There's a rhythm to it: dig, place, pack, move, like a soggy dance minus the applause. By tree number 12, you're in the zone, hands black with soil, arms, aching legs splattered. And just as you're getting cocky, your sandal slips and you fall flat into the mud. The farmer laughs so hard he drops a sapling. You lay there for a moment contemplating life choices, then slowly rise more soil than human now. While you scrub your hands in the canal, questionable hygiene, but whatever, he explains, something curious. Some chinampas were surrounded by trees on all four sides, creating a square of reinforced earth that almost resembled a sacred enclosure. Some believe it wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. The trees marked space, divided the land, and maybe even served as a sort of living calendar. Historians still argue whether these arboreal boundaries had ceremonial meaning or were just the ancient version of garden fences. But in a culture where plants were tied to gods, planets, and poetry, it's hard to imagine they were just for erosion control. After rinsing off, you help weave a low barrier from trimmed willow branches along the canal edge. It's almost like making a basket sideways. These woven fences trap sediment, catch debris, and give fish a shady place to chill. Fish get stressed too, okay. You pause to admire your work. The new saplings sway gently in the breeze, their leaves fluttering like green flags. Over time, their roots will dig deep, stabilizing the chinampa. Their branches will be harvested for firewood, tools, maybe even art. Nothing here goes unused. Quirky, detailed time. There's some evidence that love spells and romantic prayers were whispered beneath willow trees on chinampas. Supposedly, the sway of the branches carried messages to the gods, or maybe just made everything feel a bit more poetic. Either way, if you want to woo someone in Tenochtitlan, bring flowers and pick a shady willow spot. By midday, you're sitting beneath one such tree, your back resting against its young trunk. The wind is cooler here, the canal water dark and still beside you. A turtle bobs to the surface, blinks once, and disappears again. You take a long drink from your water gourd and sigh. Somehow, despite the heat and the bugs in the mud, it feels right. The willows around you sway gently. You watch their reflections in the water, a quiet dance of green and gold. The light shifts. A flock of birds takes off their wings, sending ripples across the canal. In the distance, you hear drumming. Not urgent, just a slow, steady rhythm. Someone's preparing for a feast or a festival, or maybe just marking time the way music always has. You think back to your first steps on these chinampas, unsure and awkward. Now covered in sweat and soil, you feel like part of the landscape. Temporary, yes, but real. And it hits you then how everything here relies on everything else. The trees need the soil needs the lake needs the sun, the people need all of it. And in the middle of that tangle, muddy, glorious, half-submerged, is you. You reach out and touch the base of the nearest tree. It's smooth, warm, pulsing faintly with life. In a few years, it'll be taller than you. In a few decades, it might hold up someone else's garden. You smile, wipe your face with a rag that only makes things worse, and stand up. Time to plant one more. You're late. Not terribly late, but late enough that your neighbor gives you the side eye as you arrive on the chinampa with an empty basket and sleep still in your eyes. Today is harvest day, and in this part of the Aztec world, that's as close as it gets to a holiday. The sun hasn't fully risen yet, but the fields are already buzzing. Literally, bees hover over marigolds, frogs plop lazily between rows of beans, and the air is thick with the soft rustle of leaves being touched by careful hands. You grab your woven basket and kneel between rows of amaranth. Harvesting is more dance than labor. You lean, pluck, twist, move. It's a full-body rhythm, and while your muscles ache from yesterday's willow wrestling adventure, your mind sinks into the quiet music of the field, the flap of wings, the murmur of water, and somewhere behind you, someone singing off-key about tamales. Amaranth is delicate but vital, a pseudo-grain that kept generations alive. You pluck each cluster, gently brushing off tiny spiders and whispering a small apology to any insects you displace. Harvesters here believe that plants should be taken with respect or they won't grow back properly. Whether it's science or superstition, it doesn't hurt to say thanks. Next come the tomatoes, tiny, sun-warmed, and slightly sticky. You bite into one and it explodes in your mouth, sweet, acidic, and much juicier than anything in a modern grocery store. A nearby woman eyes your sampling technique and smirks. "Quality control," she asks. You nod solemnly. Essential. Mainstream historical fact incoming: the Aztecs cultivated a wide variety of crops on chinampas, including corn, squash, beans, chilies, tomatoes, and herbs, forming a perfectly balanced nutritional triangle. Corn gave calories, beans gave protein, and squash offered healthy fats and storage longevity. Add chili for flavor, and congratulations, you've got the ancient version of a well-rounded meal plan. As you turn down another row, your hand brushes something unexpected. It wriggles. You yelp. A frog hops out of the way, offended by your lack of composure. Another follows. Turns out the chinampas aren't just gardens, they're ecosystems. Frogs, snakes, lizards, and eels slither through the canals, keeping pests in check and occasionally scaring unprepared gardeners. You laugh it off and continue down the path, balancing your basket like a wobbly crown. In the next section, someone's already begun bundling squash blossoms. Bright yellow, papery, and edible, they'll be used in soups or mixed with maize dough. You lean in for a sniff. They smell like sunshine and water. You pass a young boy hauling a net filled with axolotls. Yes, again. These smiling aquatic weirdos aren't just spiritual symbols, they're food. High in protein, easy to raise in the canals, and honestly, kind of adorable if you ignore the bit where people deep fry them. He nods proudly at you, then wobbles off to the market. Now for the flowers. In a separate, carefully marked section, rows of cempasúchil marigolds glow like tiny suns. These aren't just for decoration, they're offerings for rituals woven into garlands, floated down canals, and sometimes tucked into corn bundles to appease the gods of fertility and harvest. Quirky detail alert: rumor has it that some chinampa gardeners had favorite plants, ones they secretly named Talk To, and refused to harvest. Like, nope, that tomato is special, he gets to live. Were these farmers eccentric? Maybe. But if you spend every day in a lake garden full of frogs, snakes, and singing neighbors, you might develop a few quirks too. You're halfway through your work when a woman down the row calls out. You look up and she tosses something your way. You fumble it in the air before realizing it's a chili pepper. Bright red. Evil in edible form. You bite into it. Huge mistake. Your tongue goes numb, your eyes water, and you may or may not make a sound like a distant llama. She laughs so hard she nearly drops her squash. Gringo moves, someone mutters behind you. You recover slowly, drinking from your gourd and vowing revenge, possibly in the form of sneaking extra spicy chilies into someone's stew. As the morning deepens, so does the harvest pile. Baskets overflow. Canoes are filled with bundles of produce, each item stacked like art. The symmetry is striking chilies in rows, corn bundled like gold bars, flowers on top as if each canoe were a wedding bouquet for the gods. The market awaits, but for now, there's still work to do. You follow an elder who gestures for your help, lifting a large root-bound cluster of beans. As you dig, he explains how some crops are planted together intentionally. Beans climb the corn stalks, squash shades the soil, and chilies keep pests away. It's a system called the Three Sisters, older than even the Aztec Empire, passed down through countless generations. You help lift the bundle into his canoe. He pats your shoulder and offers a tamale from his pouch. You bite in cautiously. Sweet corn, maybe a bit of cactus, and thankfully no more surprise chilies. Historians still argue whether chinampa harvests were taxed by the empire or simply expected as tribute from each family unit. There's evidence that excess produce was sent to Tenochtitlan as part of an elaborate network of redistribution. But either way, if you were a skilled gardener, you were respected, powerful even. By midday, the work slows. The sun now rests overhead, beating down on the lake and making everything shimmer. You sit at the edge of the chinampa, feet dangling in the canal. A snake swims lazily past, ignoring you. Your hands are scratched, your clothes are filthy, but you feel something like pride. Not because you're good at this, you're not, but because the rhythm of the harvest has pulled you in. There's something timeless here, peaceful, purposeful. The day's work isn't quite done, but your body's already entering nap mode. You lie back, close your eyes, and feel the chinampa humming beneath you, alive, full of frogs and roots and the quiet, steady promise of another meal tomorrow. You're awake before the birds this time, not out of ambition, out of nerves. Because today you're not just gardening, you're dealing with the gods. The air is thick with mist as you paddle through the canals toward a larger chinampa. This one is different. No crops, just flowers, cempasúchil copal, and tlalxochitl, sacred water flowers arranged in concentric circles. In the center, a flat stone altar glistens with dew and dried wax. This is a ritual garden, a place where the boundaries between earth and spirit run thin. The man who guides you here is a priest farmer. He wears a robe dyed a deep indigo and speaks softly like someone who doesn't want to wake the soil. You're here to assist in one of the many ceremonies dedicated to Tlaloc, god of rainwater, and occasional tantrums. Tlaloc isn't one to mess with. He giveth and he drowneth. If he's pleased, the rains come gently and the crops grow strong. If not, well, hope you like floods rot and corn that molds in the field. Today's ritual is meant to coax his favor, light incense, offer flowers, maybe sacrifice a toad or two, depending on how things go. Mainstream historical fact: Aztec agriculture was deeply intertwined with religious life. Nearly every phase of farming, from sowing to harvest, was marked with specific prayers, dances, and offerings. Ritual wasn't an add-on, it was infrastructure. You help set up the altar. The priest places jade beads in a bowl of water and lights a stick of copal incense, its smoke rising in slow spirals. He chants a prayer to the lake spirits and gestures for you to place a handful of marigolds beside a clay frog statue. You comply, whispering something halfway between reverence and apology. Around the garden, others kneel in silence. Children carry bundles of seeds. Elders sprinkle cornmeal in wide arcs, forming a symbolic net to catch the favor of the gods. Someone starts beating a small drum, its rhythm steady like the heartbeat of the earth. You feel your pulse slow to match it. Now for the toad part. The priest reaches into a clay jar and pulls out a small, plump amphibian. It blinks unconcerned. In older days, this toad might not have made it out alive. Animal sacrifices were a regular part of early Tlaloc worship, but today things are gentler. The toad is blessed, dabbed with blue paint, and released into the canal with a soft plop. You swear it looks relieved. Historians still argue about the extent of blood sacrifice in daily agricultural rites. Some believe these rituals were often symbolic or reserved for high festivals. Others argue that even small community events involve real offerings, especially during times of drought or crop failure. Either way, you're glad your role today is floral. As the sun climbs, the ritual shifts into celebration. Musicians arrive in canoes playing wooden flutes and turtleshell drums. A woman dances barefoot in the mud, her skirt swirling as she tosses petals into the air. You watch entranced as everything becomes color and movement. Quirky fact: some chinampa rituals included the bearing of ears of corn wrapped in paper and tied with hair. Yes, human hair. A symbolic conversation with the earth. One farmer once told you, the soil listens better when you give it something personal. You hope that doesn't include fingernails. A midday meal follows. You sit cross-legged on woven mats, sharing tamales filled with squash blossoms, drinking fermented maguey sap, which tastes a little like spicy plant water, and laughing with strangers you now know by the rhythm of their shovels. Across from you, a woman tells the story of how her grandmother once grew a chili plant that bore fruit in the shape of Tlaloc's face. She claims it only happened once during a season with perfect rain. You try not to ask whether it also had teeth. By late afternoon, the formal parts of the ritual are over. The altar is dismantled, the flowers returned to the earth or floated out onto the canals. One canoe glides away silently, bearing only the toad jar and a flute player humming to himself. You linger a little longer sitting by the water's edge. You dip your fingers into the canal, tracing small circles. The water is cool, comforting, mysterious. You think about how the Aztecs believed every natural force had a personality, a mood, a hunger. It's easy to see why. This place doesn't feel neutral. The soil isn't just soil. The water isn't just water. They're listening. The priest sits beside you, suddenly quiet. He hands you a piece of roasted maize. You did well, he says. The earth noticed. You take a bite. It tastes earthy and sweet with just a hint of charcoal. In a world where agriculture is religion, a good harvest is a sacred pact. You plant, you pray, you compost, you dance. And in return, the lake gives back. But only if you ask nicely. You're lounging on the edge of a chinampa, pretending to check on squash vines while secretly enjoying a mid-morning nap. That is until a sleek canoe glides past, lacquered, polished, and absolutely not a farmer's vessel. 3 men in embroidered cloaks row silently. In the center of the boat sits a woman cloaked in white, holding a small parasol made from palm fronds. The air around her seems cooler. She doesn't paddle. She doesn't blink. She barely exists in the same world as you, the mud-covered peasant impersonator. This your neighbor whispers is a noblewoman, and that chinampa she's headed to one of the forbidden gardens. These elite gardens are rarely spoken of openly, and certainly not shared with outsiders. They exist somewhere between privilege and politics, tucked into the folds of the lake, where regular farmers rarely go. You gather your courage and trail behind, keeping a respectful distance and hoping no one notices your still damp tunic and chili-stained fingers. You reach a cluster of isolated chinampas surrounded by reed fences and posted with clay figurines that double as spiritual warning signs. One of them looks suspiciously like it's sticking out its tongue at you. A subtle hint, go home. But curiosity wins. From your hiding place, okay, it's a very obvious bush. You watch as noble gardeners, dressed in far cleaner tunics than yours, move with practiced elegance among perfect rows of rare flowers, medicinal herbs, and fruit trees you haven't seen anywhere else. One carries a basket lined with rabbit fur, Another sprinkles something over the soil from a golden gourd. Mainstream fact. The Aztec elite maintained private chinampas, not just for food, but for ritual plants, cosmetics, dyes, and even personal indulgences. These gardens were as much as status symbols as they were productive farmland. Think Versailles, but soggy and with way more frogs. You watch as a young noble lad plucks a flower and tucks it behind a girl's ear. She smacks his hand away with royal disdain. Even flirting here feels ceremonial. And then a tray is carried out. On it, tiny tortillas made from white maize, a luxury and a paste you suspect is ground amaranth mixed with honey and maguey syrup. You're too far to smell it, but you imagine it tastes like the end of all wars. As they eat, a small band plays soft flute music from another canoe floating gently nearby, like a sentient lullaby. Suddenly, a dog barks behind you. Not a big dog. A tiny, hairless, slightly confused-looking Zoloitzkintli. It trots up and stares at you. You stare back. The nobles notice. You're caught. Instead of banishment or execution, which you briefly picture as being drowned in marigolds, you're simply waved away, shooed off like a mosquito. It's humiliating and weirdly comforting. At least you're not important enough to punish. You retreat to your own chinampa, where your neighbor greets you with a raised eyebrow. How was your botanical espionage, he asks. You shrug. Colorful, exclusive, forbidden snacks, quirky tidbit. Some reports suggest elite chinampas were used for secret feasts where nobles consume rare fruits, fermented drinks, and even hallucinogenic mushrooms in elaborate ceremonies. These events blurred the lines between dinner party and divine communion. Of course you didn't get an invite, but the mushroom rumor, very real. Later in the community cooking area, the gossip begins. Apparently the noblewoman was a temple priestess inspecting crops meant for an upcoming offering. Or maybe she was a royal concubine. Or maybe she was an avatar of Xochiquetzal, the goddess of beauty and fertility, checking in on her flower stash. You'd believe any of it. As night falls, you gather with neighbors over a small fire. Everyone shares their modest harvest, maize cakes, bean stew, roasted insects don't ask, and chili paste strong enough to knock over a canoe. You take a bite, eyes watering, but it feels more honest than anything you saw in the noble garden. Because here the food is simple, the music is loud, and the conversation is filled with laughter and mudcake jokes. You think about the forbidden chinampas, about the golden gourd and the dog with the confused face. You're still not sure what you saw was real or just a dream conjured by the heat and the scent of marigolds. But one thing is clear, farming in Tenochtitlan isn't just survival, it's theater. It's hierarchy, it's politics. The kind that grows on water and wraps itself in flower petals. Historians still argue about the full extent of elite involvement in Chinampa agriculture. Some suggest noble plots were largely ceremonial. Others believe the elite actively manage or commission crop types for trade healing or ritual. Either way, they had options, and options always mean power. The fire crackles low. Someone plays a drum made from stretched deerskin. A child falls asleep on her grandmother's lap holding a corn husk doll. You glance up at the stars. Even out here, floating somewhere between mud and moonlight, the world feels divided yet connected. Rich and poor. Ritual and reality. Snake and eagle. And maybe tomorrow you'll return to your humble rows of beans. But tonight you've seen something gilded and tasted, however faintly, the forbidden. It's still dark when you're shaken awake by your neighbor. No flute music this time. No sleepy ducks. Just urgency. Get up, he whispers, tossing you a water gourd and a bundle of dried corn cakes. Today we prep the chinampas for war. You blink. War, he nods grimly, or at least the idea of it. That's what the maize is for. Welcome to the less peaceful side of floating farms. As you follow him through the early fog, you notice others doing the same, loading baskets, sharpening obsidian tools and carrying bundles of herbs and feathers. It looks like harvest day, but heavier. Today, the chinampa isn't just about feeding families. It's about feeding an empire. You paddle out to a section of the lake rarely used for daily farming. These plots, your neighbor explains, are military chinampas designed to grow durable, high-yield crops for warriors on campaign-dried maize. Amaranth bars, salted fish chili paste. Basically ancient MREs with way more flavor. Mainstream historical fact, the Aztec Empire relied heavily on its chinampa system to support military expansion. Food from these floating farms fed not just civilians, but marching armies, temple feasts, and vast tribute networks. Without steady supply, the empire would have collapsed under its own ambitions. You and the others begin reinforcing the soil, planting extra dense rows of corn and beans designed to sprout fast and survive being stored for weeks. You even add cactus paddles around the edges for defense and snacks. Then someone arrives with a sack of ducks. Apparently trained ducks are used for pest control on high-value chinampas. They waddle down rows eating insects, leaving behind a fertilizer boost, and then waddling home like little feathery employees clocking out. You release a few, watch them go to work, and silently wonder if there's a duck union. While planting, you overhear two farmers debating crop choices. One insists on chilies for their preservative properties. The other says they're too spicy for long campaigns. Warriors need fire in the soul, not the stomach, one argues. Says the man who cried into his tamale last week, the other counters. Classic. Historians still argue whether specific military chinampas existed in large centralized numbers or were simply part of a rotating system across various city-states. Some think local lords coordinated wartime agriculture via tribute records. Others believe it was less organized and more reliant on custom and community. Either way, your muscles don't care. You're deep in mud again, planting extra amaranth valued not just as a food source but also as ritual fuel. Amaranth was shaped into statues of gods and warriors, eaten during festivals and military send-offs. Today, your batch might become part of a battalion's meal or an offering before battle. As the sun rises, a priest arrives. You recognize him from the ritual garden. Today, he wears war paint and carries a drum. He blesses the field, chanting a prayer to Huitzilopochtli, the sun and war god. His words slice through the mist like flint. A hawk circles overhead. You pause to drink. The water tastes of algae and clay. Your hands are blistered. But there's energy here. Something potent. A young boy beside you carves glyphs into a clay tablet, recording which chinampas were planted, what crops were used, and who worked them. It's a form of accountability, also possibly a motivational tool. You consider drawing a small cartoon duck in the corner. Quirky tidbit. Some stories suggest coated corn bundles were sent to field generals marked with specific knots, feathers, or colors to indicate not just content, but also strategy. Deliver these red-tied ears to the west gate might mean reinforce the flank. Is it true? No one can say for sure. But the idea of corn espionage is deeply satisfying. Later, you help load canoes with the day's work, maize chili paste, wrapped in banana leaves, salted fish packed in clay jars. Each boat becomes a floating pantry destined for city markets or military depots. As you stack bundles, a girl passes you a small package dried corn smut. For strength, she says. You blink. Corn smut huitlacoche is a fungal infection that turns kernels into gray puffed masses. Sounds terrible. Tastes delicious. It's a delicacy used for its smoky flavor and medicinal properties. Apparently, warriors swear by it. You pop a piece in your mouth. It's earthy, weird, and kind of amazing. As the sun climbs, you take a moment to rest on a low reed bench near the canal. Around you, chinampas buzz with quiet urgency. Everyone is focused but not panicked. This is just another kind of harvest, one meant to feed ambition, pride, and survival. And in a world where crops become tribute becomes power, and power becomes expansion, Your humble row of squash suddenly feels a lot more political. Someone nearby hums a marching song, not a loud one, just a soft, persistent rhythm. You tap your foot to match it. Tomorrow maybe you'll return to flower beds and tamale jokes. But today the chinampa is a battlefield in disguise, a stage for strategy, a quiet engine for an empire with gods on its side and corn in its boats. And just maybe, a few ducks running the real show. By now you've planted, harvested, composted, even flirted poorly with chili-tossing neighbors. But today you stumble into a full-blown turf war Aztec style. And no, it's not fought with obsidian clubs. It's fought with words, gestures, and the occasional passive-aggressive flute solo. You're at a small gathering near a communal fire, sipping maize porridge that tastes like warm rain and mild regret. Two older men, both with hands like tree bark and eyes sharper than eagle talons, begin arguing. Loudly, in Nahuatl, about canals. You glance at your neighbor. Are they fighting over water again? Sort of, he says. They're arguing about who made this city great, the engineers or the farmers. And suddenly you're in the middle of one of Tenochtitlan's oldest unresolved debates. Mainstream historical fact: Tenochtitlan was a masterpiece of urban engineering featuring aqueducts, canals, causeways, dikes, and reservoirs, some of which could rival Roman systems. But the city's very survival also depended on its chinampa-fed food system. Without the farmers, the city would starve. Without the engineers, it would sink. So, who gets the credit? The first old man, who clearly used to carry a surveying rod instead of a hoe, boasts about how he and his team rerouted a canal using only stick sandbags and the stern gaze of a temple priest. The water obeyed, he says proudly. The second, covered in soil and righteous fury, points at a row of maize and shouts, "Yes, and what did you drink with your breakfast?" Water brought to you in my squash. Historians still argue whether the city's layout prioritized engineering marvels or adapted around existing agricultural needs. Did the chinampas shape the city, or did the city shape where the chinampas were allowed to flourish? A younger man chimes in, offering the diplomatic answer. Maybe it was both. They ignore him. To cool off, you head down a canal for some solo reflection time, floating quietly beneath the tangled branches of willow and ahuejote. The more you think about it, the more it makes sense. This city is a dialogue, a negotiation between the rigidity of plans and the messiness of mud. On one bank, you pass a section where a new retaining wall is being built. Dozens of workers stack stones reinforced with clay and wedge bundles of reeds between gaps. A foreman directs them with gestures that look suspiciously like an ancient form of jazz hands. On the opposite side, you see a team of gardeners shaping a new canampa by layering compost sediment and sticks. There's no shouting, just quiet determination, like they've done this before, probably 1,000 times. Both sides, builders and growers, depend on each other. The walls protect the gardens make the city worth protecting. You stop at a crossroads of canals where water meets water in perfect geometry. It's strangely beautiful, like a watery crossword puzzle. You remember someone saying the Aztecs saw the city as a cosmic diagram with cardinal directions, sacred centers, and mirrored symbols. Quirky tidbit. One school of thought claims the Chinampa system was deliberately designed to mirror the Aztec calendar, with rows and divisions echoing days, months, and festival cycles. Whether that's architecture or apophenia, no one knows. But when you stand here surrounded by symmetry, it's hard to believe it's all coincidence. You paddle back to shore, where the engineers and farmers are now seated side by side, sharing a tole and occasionally grumbling. The argument has cooled. For now. Someone tells a joke, something about a builder, a priest in a canoe full of eels. It doesn't quite translate, but everyone laughs. You laugh too, mostly because your arms are tired and your brain is soft from too much sun. Later, you sit with your neighbor and watch the light fade across the lake. Do you think they'll ever agree, you ask? He shrugs. Doesn't matter. The corn grows either way. You smile at that because in a city built on water, arguments come and go like ripples. What stays behind are the gardens, the roots, the slow-growing things. Before bed, you pass a carved stone marker at the edge of a canal. It's etched with both agricultural symbols, maize squash frogs and geometric lines, possibly a map or a record of construction. No single symbol stands out. They blend together, soil and stone, harvest and plan. Maybe that's the real answer. The greatness of Tenochtitlan didn't come from choosing sides. It came from holding the tension between them, making space for both the builder's blueprint and the gardener's messy hope. And here you are, somewhere in the middle, covered in mosquito bites, navigating the most elegant argument the world never finished. Evening falls slow in Tenochtitlan. The heat recedes, the breeze picks up, and the city seems to slip into a second rhythm, one that glides across water rather than stomping over dirt. You push off from shore in a small canoe, joining the parade of lantern-lit boats drifting toward the night market. Tonight you're not farming, you're floating. The water is calm, mirroring the last streaks of orange in the sky. Around you, canoes bob like oversized lily pads, some piled high with produce, others stacked with bundles of herbs, firewood, or tamales wrapped tight in banana leaves. You drift slowly through what can only be described as a traffic jam of paddles and produce. Two canoes ahead of you nearly collide over a misunderstanding involving bean prices and someone's injured duck. You witness some heated whisper yelling, followed by a tense exchange of chilies. It's resolved peacefully, mostly. The Tlatelolco market, the largest in the empire, doesn't close at sundown. Not really. It just spills out into the canals, continuing by torchlight and moonglow. And while the official stalls on land may rest the waterbound vendors, they thrive. Your canoe glides past a woman selling bundles of fresh herbs, epizot wormseed, and mint. She offers you a handful. You trade it for a single axolotl egg wrapped in corn husk. Somehow that's a fair deal. Market logic is mysterious. Mainstream historical fact, Tlatelolco's market served over 60,000 people daily at its peak. The canal-based night market was an extension of this economy, allowing for 24/7 trade and transport of goods. Canoe commerce kept the empire's heartbeat steady even when the city slept. Further along, you pass a boat covered in flowers, cempasúchil, and morning glories woven into long chains. The vendors sing softly to draw attention. You stop to admire her handiwork and end up buying a garland for no reason other than its scent. It smells like clean water and tomorrow. You dock your canoe at a floating platform lit by small clay lamps. It's a temporary pop-up stall selling roasted insects, maize cakes, and an ominously spicy salsa. A boy waves you over, offering a sample. You burn your tongue and say thank you anyway. People mill about on planks lashed together between chinampas, creating floating footpaths and makeshift shelves. It's a maze of smells and textures: dried fish chocolate discs, lime-soaked cornmeal feathers, and obsidian blades so sharp they whisper when moved. You're handed a cup of chocolate, unsweetened, thick, bitter, and frothy. A noble's drink, yes, but here sold in small sips. You swirl it in your mouth and pretend you can taste the divine. Beside you, a man sells canoe charms, tiny carved turtles, frogs, and corn cobs. You pick one shaped like a chili pepper and tie it to your paddle. For luck, he says, or at least for spicier dreams. Quirky tidbit. Some canoe traders believed that placing obsidian flakes under the seat would protect against theft and bad deals. Others preferred maize dolls or tiny bags of salt tied to the prow. Superstition and business always close companions. You take a side canal away from the crowd and find yourself drifting through a quieter section. Here the market fades into silence. A lone flute plays somewhere nearby. Fireflies dot the shadows. You pass a canoe with an old woman selling dreams, yes dreams, written on paper strips. Take one, she croaks. You do. It reads, you will become the soil you tend. Comforting or creepy. You decide not to decide. Your boat bumps softly against the edge of another, where two teens are sharing grilled fish and laughing. They offer you a bite. You share your maize cakes. No one needs to talk. Floating beside someone, food between you, that's enough. Historians still argue whether the night market was officially sanctioned or if it grew organically alongside the formal economy. Some claim it was a city planner's nightmare. Others say it was genius, a decentralized, self-regulating market that extended the reach of trade into every watery vein of the city. You paddle slowly back toward home basket half full, mind even fuller. The canals are quieter now. Most of the vendors have packed up. A few canoes drift with sleeping children curled inside, rocked gently by the water. You think about the city, how it floats not on magic but on people. People paddling, planting, trading, singing, arguing about engineering, and sharing chocolate in the dark. The market doesn't just feed the body, it feeds the pulse of the place. As your chinampa comes into view, you pass one last vendor, a man asleep in his boat surrounded by untouched bundles of maize. A clay lantern flickers at his feet. You leave a chilly charm beside him, payment maybe, or just a thank you for holding up the dream a little longer. You dock silently. The water laps against the shore. The scent of flowers lingers in your nose. Your feet are sore, your basket smells like 10 kinds of food, and there's chocolate on your sleeve. But you wouldn't trade this floating chaos for anything. This morning begins with chanting, not the kind you've heard before, no drums, no incense, no frogs serenading the sunrise. This is soft, rhythmic, repetitive, and very, very young. You follow the sound to a chinampa flanked by carved poles and colorful banners. A narrow canoe pulls alongside and an older man beckons you in. Come, he says with a knowing grin. It's time you see how the next generation learns to farm. You're headed to one of the Calmacac, the elite temple schools of the Aztec world. Except this one floats part classroom, part garden, part holy experiment. Here, young nobles are trained not just in war math or philosophy, but in agriculture, the divine art that keeps empires upright. The boat glides quietly through shaded canals, arriving at a chinampa bordered by willows and marked with colorful stone glyphs. On the shore, a group of teens stands in a crooked line, each holding a digging stick like it's a sacred spear. One boy drops his and gets smacked gently on the head with a squash. Lesson 1, Humility. Mainstream historical fact. While commoner children often learn farming through family labor, noble children in Kalmakacs studied it as a symbolic skill. To grow food was to imitate the gods who created maize, and to tend the land was to understand balance, patience, and divine reciprocity. You sit on a low bench as the instructor begins the morning's lesson plant, with both hands and one foot in the lake. It's part poetry, part literal advice. One hand for digging, one for placing the seed, and one foot for steadying yourself in the soggy terrain. The students demonstrate. One slips into the mud with a yelp. The rest try not to laugh. They rotate tasks. One group works with herbs, another weaves reed fences, a third balances on a log while trying to transplant squash seedlings. You wince as one kid falls in completely. He emerges with a grin and a handful of eels. Extra credit. Your guide explains that farming here isn't about volume, it's about symbolism. Each student must plant 4 sacred crops, maize, amaranth, chilies, and beans, each representing a direction, a deity, and an aspect of life. The garden becomes a microcosm of the universe. Historians still argue whether these symbolic lessons were more religious than practical. Some scholars think noble farming was mostly ceremonial. Others insist it was hands-on, a method to reinforce humility, patience, and the cycles of divine labor. The truth likely somewhere in the mud between. The students chant as they plant Tlazokamati Kentli. Thank you, corn, you murmur it with them. The instructor raises an eyebrow. Not bad, he says. But next time, kneel. You kneel. Later, the students move to the flotation lab, a shallow canal where they test water quality clarity and sediment richness. One girl scoops water into a gourd and swirls it. Too green, she says. Needs duckweed but not algae. Another sniffs the soil and declares it 3 days past ready. You pretend you knew that. One boy shows you his experiment, a floating garden box suspended on inflated gourds. For deep lakes, he explains proudly. Or if the water spirits rise, you not impressed. Secretly, you're thinking that kid's ready to run a startup. Quirky tidbit. Some floating gardens may have doubled as philosophy classrooms, with students required to meditate among the plants and record insights and glyphs on bark paper. Every corn leaf is a question, one teacher once said, and most are about rain. After lunch, maize tamales and a suspiciously spicy drink, the lesson shifts to defensive gardening. The students learn how to build raised beds that can survive floods, how to paddle while hauling compost, and how to identify enemy chinampas. Apparently, the trick is in the tree spacing. You're not sure if this is school or a military exercise disguised as landscaping. You get paired with a girl who's assigned to teach the outsider. She shows you how to knot a vine trellis, how to dig a furrow with your heel, and how to fold a maize leaf into a rain hat. She speaks gently, but moves fast. You try to keep up. You don't. As the day ends, the instructor gathers everyone on the dock. He points at the horizon. The gods gave you roots, he says, but you must learn to float. The students bow. Some smile. One throws an eel at his friend. The boat ride home is slow golden and filled with the sound of tired kids singing ancient songs about fish and harvest moons. One boy sleeps curled around a basket of chilies. Another practices his knot tying on your ankle. You let him. You glance back at the school barely visible now through the reeds. A garden, a classroom, a temple on water, and somewhere in that chorus of muddy knees and calloused hands, the future of a floating world is being quietly, stubbornly grown. The rain comes without warning. One moment the sky is soft and sulky. The next it opens like an upturned jug, and you're soaked to the bone in 5 seconds flat. Water drums against the chinampas soil, splashes into the canal, streaks down your arms in muddy little rivulets. You blink through the downpour, laugh once sharp and startled, and then start grabbing anything that might float away. Rain is good, usually, unless it's this kind of rain. Your neighbor's already out securing tools and weaving new reed barriers where the canal banks are sagging. You throw on a rough tunic and join him slipping twice on the slick planks before managing to lash down a basket of harvested beans. The storm howls through the trees. Willow branches whip side to side, some cracking under the force. The chinampa groans beneath your feet, alive and stressed. You crouch low and hold tight. This isn't just weather. This is a test. Mainstream historical fact. The chinampa system was incredibly resilient to floods and droughts thanks to its elevated beds and surrounding canals that absorbed excess water. But that didn't mean it was invincible. Storms could collapse canal banks, drown seedlings, or scatter crops into the lake like lost confetti. You work all afternoon rebuilding a broken edge, plunging your hands into the muck to stuff reed bundles between posts. The water stings your eyes. Your nose is full of mud. You're pretty sure a frog just swam up your sleeve. Later, someone shouts. A floating bed of maize has detached, sucked into the canal like a lazy raft. Several neighbors launch canoes and chase it down, shouting, laughing, swearing creatively. They rope it back to shore and secure it with heavy rocks. Crisis averted. For now. Historians still argue whether chinampa maintenance was managed individually or communally in times of disaster. Some claim every family tended their own plot. Others insist collective labor was the default. But watching everyone work together now, soaked in laughing and silently competitive, you're starting to lean communal. When the rain finally stops, the lake is glass again, too calm like it's pretending nothing happened. The sky drips with exhausted clouds. You collapse onto a patch of relatively dry earth arms, shaking heart still rattling from the storm. A small girl offers you a tortilla filled with sweet beans and a slice of roasted chili. To say thanks, she says, for helping the water not eat our food. You take it and nod. Honestly, it's the best thing you've eaten in weeks. But just as things settle, the real horror arrives: mildew. It creeps in quietly like gossip. Within a day, one section of your chinampa turns yellow and limp. Leaves wilt. Beans rot on the vine. You curse under your breath. You've seen this before: rain sickness, some call it. The gods sneezing on your garden, others say. Your neighbor suggests ash. Another swears by crushed snail shells. A passing child recommends frog pea. You pretend to consider all three. Quirky tidbit. Some farmers believe tying obsidian flakes or jade beads to sick plants could draw out the bad water spirits. Others chanted directly at their corn, hoping to shame it back to health. Modern science calls these practices ineffective. The corn might disagree. You try everything: ash, prayer, better drainage, shade mats. You even yell at the mildew a little. That part helps you more than the plants. Then come the pests: slugs, snails, fat, complacent caterpillars the size of your thumb. They crawl out of the damp with smug expressions, chewing through what the storm spared. You build barriers, release ducks, smear chili paste around the beds. You consider building a scarecrow out of your worst sandal. Desperate times. As you work, an elder wanders by and sighs. The chinampa is a mirror, she says. Sometimes it reflects your effort, sometimes your mistakes. You nod slowly. Also sometimes your dinner if you're unlucky enough to drop it in the canal. Despite the setbacks the system endures, you lose a few rows, but the others bounce back. You replant. You adjust. You lean on neighbors and pass on advice. One day someone calls you over to help with a collapsed bank, and you're the one giving instructions now. You don't notice it at first, but you've learned something. You're not just floating anymore. You're rooted. Historians still debate how often entire chinampas had to be rebuilt after storms or disease. Some say they lasted for decades with little maintenance. Others argue for a constant cycle of rebuilding, composting, reinforcing. Either way, one thing is certain: chinampas were not fragile. They flexed, they adapted, and they required hands, lots of them. By week's end, the sun returns, warm and slow. You walk through your recovering garden, checking leaves, touching soil, whispering a little thanks here and there. A toad hops from row to row like a tiny grumpy foreman. At the edge of your plot, something new has sprouted: a squash seed that drifted during the storm and decided against all odds to root in a patch of broken soil. You crouch down and smile. It's lopsided, it's unexpected, and it's growing, because that's what chinampas do. They float, they fall apart, they find their way back. You hear them before you see them. Metal striking stone, shouting, barking dogs, the uneven rhythm of boots that never learned how to tread water. You crouch low in the shadow of a maize wall as the first Spanish soldiers appear along the edge of the canal, their armor gleaming in the sun like ill-placed mirrors. One of them slips and barely avoids a swan dive into the water. Another curses in Spanish and kicks a canoe. The canoe wins, and just like that, your chinampa becomes a battlefield, or at least a very confused, very soggy military obstacle course. Mainstream historical fact. When Hernán Cortés and his men entered the Valley of Mexico in the early 16th century, they found themselves at a significant disadvantage in the watery landscape of Tenochtitlan. Horses stumbled on narrow causeways, armor rusted in the humidity, and their traditional battle tactics were ill-suited for a city that floated. You watch from a distance as the Spaniards attempt to cross a narrow canal using planks. One falls in. The others try to maintain dignity, but it's hard when you're soaked and being heckled in Nahuatl by children from nearby canoes. Some of your neighbors aren't even pretending to hide. They stand openly in their chinampas, daring the invaders to try something. You don't know whether to be impressed or terrified. You drift further into the canals, Some areas are eerily quiet, others bustling with secret movement, messengers paddling in low canoes, runners darting across bridges, whispered plans and coded messages tucked into corn bundles. Yes, really, quirky tidbit. There are whispered stories, probably half myth, that Aztec farmers used the planting patterns of their chinampas to send signals to the resistance. A row of squash laid diagonally might mean supply here. A trail of marigolds might mark a safe house. Was it organized guerrilla strategy or just the lake playing tricks on people? Hard to say. But in times of war, anything becomes a message. You pass a canal that once buzzed with trade, now filled with sunken canoes and scattered obsidian blades. The water, once a mirror of life, now reflects helmets and gun barrels. Still the chinampas remain, weakened, scarred, but afloat. And oh, the horses. The Spanish brought them as weapons, but they are utterly lost here. Narrow canal paths, bad. Sudden collapses into lake mud, worse. You watch one mount attempt to cross a reed bridge and instead plant its front hooves into a compost pile. It takes 4 soldiers and 2 shovels to get it free. Historians still argue whether the chinampas played a major strategic role in slowing down the Spanish. Some say the terrain gave the Aztecs an edge in early skirmishes. Others believe the psychological impact of the watery maize, the resistance hidden in flowers and frogs, was just as important as the tactical. You sneak into a storage canoe where elders have hidden food supplies under layers of flowers. They tell you the real battle isn't swords versus spears, it's time versus decay. If the food lasts longer than the invaders' patience, the city might hold. But the days grow darker. You hear news that the aqueduct has been cut. Fresh water stops flowing, crops wither in patches, canoes grow quiet, and then disease. The invaders brought it like a poisonous fog, and the chinampas, miraculous as they are, can't protect lungs or blood. One night you paddle to a ritual chinampa to find it abandoned. Flowers wilt on the altar. A frog floats belly up in the canal. Even the willows seem stiller than usual, and yet the weeds keep growing. The corn pushes upward. Somewhere a duck lays an egg in a stolen Spanish helmet. Life annoyingly continues. You think about the early days when you first stepped onto the soft, damp soil and wondered if it would hold you. When you whispered to willow saplings and burned your mouth on a chili meant for someone else. When you helped hold back a storm with nothing but reeds and hope. Now you kneel in the same mud planting one last row of beans, because even empires that fall still have tomorrow to feed. A boy appears beside you, no older than 10, his face streaked with soot. He drops a handful of seeds into your palm. This is for later, he says without explaining. You nod, because you understand. The Spanish may conquer the palaces, they may burn the temples and melt the gold, but they can't navigate these canals forever. They can't plant with one foot in the lake. They can't smell the difference between ash-soaked soil and compost ready for rebirth. This land doesn't belong to swords or boots. It belongs to roots, to water, to things that grow slowly, quietly, and return. Morning in Tenochtitlan, or what's left of it. You walk through the mist as always, but the sounds are different now. No flute music, no market chatter. Just the soft slap of water against forgotten canoe hulls, and the occasional creak of wood under its own memory. The empire has fallen, but the chinampas, they're still here. Sort of. You step carefully along a narrow path of packed earth, overgrown with vines. What was once a maze of floating gardens now feels like a submerged memory, half sunken and eerily quiet. A few plots remain tended, scrappy survivors. Most are wild, overtaken by weeds birds, and the gentle advance of water reclaiming what's hers. Your fingers trail along a crooked stalk of maize. Thin, dry, but standing. It leans a little like it's listening. Mainstream historical fact. After the fall of the Aztec Empire in 1521, the Spanish conquest rapidly restructured agriculture displacing traditional systems like chinampas in favor of European-style ranching, wheat farming, and land privatization. But chinampas didn't vanish overnight. They limped on, quietly feeding people long after the palaces crumbled. You reach an old ritual, chinampa barely recognizable. The altar is gone, its stones scattered. But in the center, a single marigold blooms defiantly through a crack in the soil. You kneel beside it. The flower smells the same, like heat, like memory, like something older than empires. A voice interrupts your thoughts. An old man, barefoot and grinning, emerges from the mist with a hoe over one shoulder. Looking for ghosts, he asks. You shake your head, just checking what's still growing. He nods. Good. That's all we've ever done. He shows you his plot, small, humble, fiercely alive. Squash vines curl over every available inch. Tomatoes glisten with dew. Ducks waddle in slow formation along the edges, like bored security guards. This is for my grandchildren, he says, and for the lake, and maybe for the gods if they still look down. Historians still argue how much of the Chinampa tradition survived in secret during the colonial period. Some say the Spanish ignored it completely. Others claim they exploited it when it suited them. But beneath the records, something always lingered, roots too deep to burn. You sit with him for a while, helping pull weeds. He tells stories in fragments about his father's father, who taught him to sing to the soil. About a woman who claimed her squash glowed under moonlight. About the last frog that used to croak along with flute songs. He insists it was in tune. Later you help him repair a fence bamboo and reeds lashed with twine. You're clumsier than before. It's been a while, but your hands remember more than you expect. The willow near the edge watches quietly. Quirky tidbit. Even today in Xochimilco, a district of modern Mexico City, you can find chinampas still in use, though many are now operated by small farmers or repurposed for tourism. Some are even being restored for ecological education and organic food programs. The floating gardens float on. The sun breaks through the mist just enough to warm your back. You glance out across the water, which shimmers with algae and duckweed and forgotten stories. Somewhere out there under layers of concrete and car horns, the rest of the gardens sleep, buried not broken. The old man hands you a gourd filled with cold maize drink. You sip. It tastes like chalk and memory. One last thing he says, pointing toward the far shore. That used to be the emperor's chinampa. You squint. Just reeds now. But you nod, imagining it flowers in perfect rows, spices drifting in the breeze, nobles in silk sandals, tiptoeing between corn stalks and scandal. It's all still here, he says, just quieter. You thank him and paddle away. The canoe glides through narrow canals that used to be bustling. The water is still. Even the egrets seem more respectful today. You pause and run your fingers through the current. You think of all the hands that have touched this water, farmers, warriors, priests, children. You think of every seed planted, every song sung to the soil, every duck that ever waddled its way into a prayer. And you realize something simple and enormous. You are not leaving ruins. You are floating on foundations, not in stone, in mud, in patience, in things that grow slow and stubborn and never quite leave. You pass a half-sunken canoe filled with flowers. No one claims it. You don't disturb it, just drift by. Because in the quiet corners of the world, some things don't die. They wait. And when the rain is right and the lake remembers, they rise. As we end tonight's journey, you feel your breath slow. The water laps gently beneath your boat. The chinampas stretch quietly into the mist, no longer needing to prove their place. The air is soft now. The frogs have begun their sleepy chorus again, and even the willows once bent in wind and storm sway gently like lullabies. You settle into the cradle of the canoe, its curve like a mother's arm. The scent of wet soil clings to your skin, not unpleasant, just earthy real. And in the distance a flute plays one last note before silence. The city has changed. The empire has faded, but the roots remember, and tonight they are holding you. So rest easy, traveler. You've wandered long. You've grown things. You've listened. And now you float. End of script. Sweet dreams.